So Mounce chapter 20, go ahead and open the Mounce textbook up as well to Mounce chapter 20. You're going to find that on page 167, okay? 167. Now, this chapter is entitled Verbal Roots and Other Forms of the Future. And again, that's Mounce's title. It's not my title, but I am going to cover all those as well. Let's start with talking about the notion of the verbal roots in the chapter, okay? He draws a distinction, and rightly so, between two very important concepts as it relates to the verb in Greek. There's the root of a verb versus the stem of a verb. Okay, so what is the verb's root? What is a verbal root according to Mounce? How does he define this? Yes, it is a verb's most basic form, okay? The root of a verb is a verb's most basic form. How do we determine what a verb's root is when we're using Mounce's textbook? It's very easy. Anytime Mounce gives you a new verb in your vocabulary list, he is going to give you an English gloss of the verb. So for luo, as an example, I loose. And then in parentheses, you're going to have some information there, one of which is an asterisk next to what looks like just a chopped off portion of that verb. That is the verbal root, okay? Now, what does the asterisk indicate here? The asterisk indicates that we're dealing with a theoretical form of the verb. That is to say, you will never see Lou hanging out all by itself in the Greek language. Lou is just a root to which other things are added to form a real verb in Greek. All right? So you'll never see this by itself. It will always have other things attached. Most notably, if we're dealing with the indicative mood, we're dealing with verbs that have personal endings. So you'll always see a personal ending attached to a verbal root of some sort. Okay? Now, Balo, in his vocab list, he'll give you I throw or cast as an English gloss. And then in the parentheses, you will get ball, which looks like a chopped off portion of that, with an asterisk, again indicating that that is not a real verbal form, but rather a theoretical part of the verbal form, and it's the most basic part. This is the part that carries the lexical semantics, okay? The root carries lexical semantics. What's lexical semantics? It's the meaning of that verb in terms of a concept. The loo root has to do with the idea of loosing something. The ball concept has to do with picking or taking something and chucking it, okay? So casting or throwing. We can modify these verbal roots with other things, and then that will give us also semantic information, but it won't be lexical semantic information. It'll be grammatical semantic information, like how many people are doing it, whether it's a first person entity doing it or a second person. That's grammatical semantics, grammatical meaning. Lexical meaning is independent of that, just has to do with the concept of the idea. Okay, does that make sense? To just give you an example using an English noun. I have the word boy, and then I have the word boys, okay? The boy part is lexical. That has the concept of male, sort of underage human being, right? The S on boys is grammatical information. It's only telling me the matter of whether there's one or many, okay? That's not a lexical issue. That's a grammatical issue in terms of meaning, okay? All right. Now, by the way, lexical semantics is what I wanted to write over here. All right. Now, a stem. What is a verb's stem? Okay, so it's a verb's basic form or most basic form in a tense. Excellent. Now, how many tenses have we learned in our lessons together? 1, 2. The present tense and the future tense. We're going to learn past tense forms coming up really soon. The aorist is one of them. And the aorist tense will also have its own tense stem, okay? But right now, we only have two tenses, so there's two forms here to work on. Luo and balo are the present. Luso and balo are the future, okay? And what I want you to see is this. The present stem of the present tense verb luo is lu. The present stem of the verb balo is bal. For the future, the present stem is, the future stem is also lu. And for balo, which is the future first person singular of balo, it's bal with one lambda. Okay? So what can you see by looking at these forms here? Well, we can see that sometimes the present stem and the future stem are the same. Sometimes, on the other hand, a verb's present stem and a verb's future stem are slightly different. Yes?
Do you use any accents with the stems?
No, not really. We're just, grabbing the consonants and the vowels. Okay, so lu is my present stem, and bal with two L's. Okay? Yep.
Why is the balo not have the sigma like the normal future?
That's a great question. And we'll talk about it a little bit later in this chapter, okay? But my point here is just for you to see that there's sometimes present stem and future stem are identical, sometimes they are different. Sometimes they are wildly different. We'll talk about that as well. Now, how do you find the tense stem of a particular verb's tense? What you do is you take the verb form in that tense and you remove certain things. You remove something called augments, which you're going to learn about in the imperfect and aorist tenses, which are the past time tenses. You remove the tense formatives. Right now, you know the sigma of the future is a tense formative. You remove that. And then you remove any personal endings. You strip those off, and what you're left with is the stem of that verb for that particular tense. And we frequently refer to that as the tense stem. All right? So if I take luo, for example, and I strip off any augments, there aren't any personal endings and augments, I'm left with lu. That's my present stem. For luso, I strip off any augments. Again, there aren't any. The tense formative and the personal ending and the connecting vowels, if there are any, all of that gets removed and I'm left with lu. Okay, so that's how I know that lu is the stem for both the present and the future. Over here, especially when we learn how to form the future of verbs like balo, we're going to strip off things and tense formatives, connecting vowels, and personal endings, and we're going to be left with our stems for the present and for the future. Okay? All right. Now, let's look at the section B here on the handout. Tense stems are derived from the verbal root. Each verb has a set of tense stems that it uses for the different tenses, and those tense stems are derived from the verbal root. Here is where Mounce shines, and this is where I think he is so helpful to students. If you really think about this, when you learn a verb, what is the form of the verb that you learn and always think of when you think about that particular verb? The present tense form. Luo, balo, akuo. Yeah? And because you associate that verb with its present active indicative first person singular, your assumption would be that that is what you start with. That's the most basic form of the verb. And then when you start learning the future tense and you see, oh my goodness, the future tense looks different than the present tense. form of the verb. This is really weird. And then you start learning the aorist tense, and you realize that the aorist form looks very different from the present. It just seems like everything in Greek is irregular. Well, we don't like that, do we? We want things to be patterned. Irregularity is from the devil, right? Presumably. And when you think everything's irregular, that almost makes you want to throw your hands up in hopelessness and say, I can't really learn Greek. Okay? The reality is that if you always think of the present tense as being the most basic form, and if you think of the future stem and the aorist stem and the perfect stem that you're going to learn, if you think those are derived from the present stem, and since they don't match the present stem, everything's irregular, you will be confused and hopeless. But the reality is that that's not the case. Rather, each of these different stems is derived from a common source, for the most part. They're all derived from the verbal root. So when you see that the future looks different from the present stem, don't think, oh, what happened to the present stem to create the future stem? You have to go, oh, how does the future stem really relate to the verbal root? How does the present stem really relate to the verbal root? How does the aorist stem really relate to the verbal root? Because that's where they come from. They come from the verbal root, not from each other. Okay? So let me helpfully give you some examples. Okay? I want to start with luo just as an example. Let me just write luo next to the verb, this first little chart here. The verbal root we learned was lu. Yes? Okay. What is the present active indicative of luo? Well, it's luo. Okay. What's the future active indicative of luo? It's luso. Good. And what's the aorist active indicative of luo? Those of you that are so far advanced. It's elusa. Okay. Now, for those of you that have not ever learned the aorist stem, don't worry. You don't have to know this to get the point I'm going to make here. It turns out that the present stem, once I strip away augments, connecting vowels, tense formatives, and whatever, is lu. For the future, it's lu. For the aorist, it's lu. Now, what does that mean? Should I think of the future stem as really just being derived from the present stem? And since the present stem is lu, the future stem took the present stem, and that's what it used. No. And the aorist didn't take the present stem lu to form its stem either. Rather, all three of them took the verbal root lu and said, I'll use you for my stem. And that's why they all happen to look the same. Okay? On the other hand, if we go now to this example, we have ball, which means to throw or cast. Okay, it's my idea of casting or throwing. This is the true verbal root of the idea of casting or throwing. Beta, alpha, lambda. Okay, so what is my present tense first person singular form? It's ballo. Okay, the future tense is ballo, and the aorist is ebalon. Okay, now you don't know this yet. You don't even know the future. Okay, but here's what I'm going to show you. The present stem is beta, alpha, lambda, lambda. The future stem, beta, alpha, lambda. The aorist stem, this is an augment that is part of the aorist formation, but it's not part of the stem. And the omicron and noon, I'm sorry, that's Hebrew. Nu, Greek. The omicron and nu are the connecting vowel and the personal ending. When I strip all that off, I'm left with ball. Okay? So guess what? The future stem is different from the present stem. And the aorist stem is different from the present stem. Is it the case that the future stem has taken the present stem and tweaked it to form the future? No. Rather, what the future stem has done is it said, hey, the root of my verb is ball, and I'm just going to adapt it unmodified for my future tense. The aorist has done the same thing. It takes the real root and says, I'll take you unmodified to form my aorist stem. The present stem, on the other hand, has taken the verbal root and done what to it? It has changed it slightly, okay? And that is frequently what is going to happen in the Greek verbal system. What's going to happen often is that the present stem is going to take the root and tweak it a little bit to form the present stem, whereas many of the other tenses won't. And so the result is that many times the present stem is the most irregular of the stems. It's the one that looks the least like the real root. So if you can learn the root of the verb, you're going to be able to actually see how that root plays itself out in the different stems and realize that each stem really is being derived from the root itself. Sometimes with modifications and sometimes without. But if you think the present stem is where the future and aorist stem are getting their stems from, and if the present stem is usually the one that doesn't look like the root, you're going to think everything's irregular. And that wouldn't be the right way to think. Yes?
Does the double L in the present stem affect pronunciation at all? Or is it strictly a...
Not really.
scribal, I guess?
Not really. Yeah, I mean, I suppose we probably hold that L sound longer because in actual speech, we're not going to stop our L sound and then do a second L sound. So balo or balo for the future, and then balo. That's a little bit of a longer lambda, I guess.
So that was the reason for adding that extra lambda.
Well, no, I mean, it's not really for pronunciation purposes. And we're going to see actually some fairly common ways that the present stem modifies its verbal root to form it. And it can be a little complicated, but if we can just get into our heads that it's the present stem that is usually modifying more the verbal root than the others, then I think we're going to accomplish our purpose here. Okay? What I'll do is I'll use this spot. So what is the real root of akuo? It's aku. All right? So what is the present form? It's akuo, like that. So what do you think the present stem is? That's right. It's aku. Okay? The future is aku, so like that. What do you think the future stem is? Aku, good. And then the aorist stem. The aorist active indicative is this, ekusa. Okay. And what you don't know yet is that the alpha of aku lengthens to form what's called an augment, which signals a past time verb form. So we unaugment it and we strip away the tense formative, which in the aorist is the sigma alpha most of the time, and I'm left with aku. Okay? So with the verb akuo, my three major tense stems happen to be all identical to each other. This is what leads to the illusion that the present stem is forming the basis for these other stems, or it's the thing from which the other tenses derive their stems. But the reality is that they all go back to the root, which is aku. It is fairly common. It is fairly common. So one of the things that we'll do, next is we're going to walk through the patterns of how the present stem is going to be related to the verbal root. Okay, so that'll be the next big thing in the chapter. Let me go ahead and I'll do one other form. Okay. Okay. What does baptizo mean? Yes, baptizo means to baptize. How many of you have ever watched Nacho Libre? Ever watched Nacho Libre?
So good.
One of my favorite conversations is, why have you not been baptized?
I got around to it.
Yes, I never got around to it, okay? So anyhow, the real root here is not baptids with a zeta, but baptid. Okay, so baptid is my real root. So I'm going to put the present active indicative baptizo here. The future is baptizo. I will baptize. And the aorist, I baptize, is a baptisa. Okay, so what's going on here? What is the real present stem of baptizo? It's baptids. For the future, it's baptid. For the aorist, it's baptid. Now, why do I just have a sigma here? When I take my delta for baptid and I add the sigma omega, remember delta is a dental, it falls out before the sigma, right? Everybody see that? Yeah? Y'all got that? Okay. So, and the sigma alpha is what's being added to baptid here, and the augment, and anyhow, again, the delta drops out. So the real stem, though, is baptid in the future and in the aorist. So what do we see? How can we, what observations can we make from this? Well, what we observe is that which stems are the most regular relative to the verbal root? The future and the aorist are actually regular. Which one is irregular relative to the root? The present stem. It's got a zeta where we just had a delta for the root. If you're thinking that baptizo is somehow modified from baptids, you're going to be all messed up, okay? But if you know that deltas before sigma fall out, and you know that the real root is baptid, and that baptid is being used for the future stem and the aorist stem, then it's actually going to be regular, not irregular to you, all right? So that's one final example, okay? Now, let us go to the next issue here. Okay, so Mounce then discusses the main patterns for how the present stem is related to the verbal root. All right? Pattern 1, which is my number 1 here, is where the root is not modified. The root is not modified. Have we seen verbs that follow this pattern? Well, we just looked at akuo, didn't we? Yeah. So the real root of akuo is aku. That's the verbal root. The present stem is akuo. And so this part is the present stem. And how does it relate to the verbal root over here? It is the same. It's unmodified, isn't it? So the present stem was formed by taking the root and not changing it. The question was asked, is this common? And the answer is absolutely, it's common. All right. Another example, this one also provided by Mounce in the chapter, is poia, which is from the verb poieo, to do or make. The present is poi. It should be poieo. The epsilon and omega are going to contract, and what will that become? It becomes an omega that is lengthened, right? So it becomes this, poi o. So how do I get to my present stem? What do? I have to strip away personal endings and connecting vowels. So when I chop this up into its parts, or for what this came out of, the present stem is actually poia, and it happens to be identical to the root. Okay, so these are situations where the root is co-opted to form the present stem, and there's no modification of the root. We love these because everything looks normal here. Okay. All right. Number 2. This is where it gets really hairy. My number 2 is also Mounce's pattern number 2. Here's where the present stem actually gets its, the present tense gets its present stem from a different root than the root we know about. Okay? Let's take a look at some examples here. First of all, let's take the word erkamai. Okay, so erkamai. What does that mean? Okay, so I come or I go. That is the present, isn't it? It's present, middle. Mounce would say it's deponent as well. Indicative, first person singular. The future, middle, indicative, is this. Now, look at erkamai and elusamai. Does it look like whatever it is that I've taken to form the future as a stem, does it look anything like the erk stem that I see? No. There is no discernible relationship between the two. And there is a reason for this. The reason is that these are coming from completely different verbal roots. The first one, erkamai, is coming from the verbal root erch, and elusamai is coming from the verbal root eluth. Okay? Eluth. Where does this elusamai come from? Well, it's eluth plus a future tense formative sigma, and what will happen to the theta before the sigma? It'll drop out, right? And so that's where the future form looks like that. And let me get rid of that sigma, because what I want you to see here is that erk and eluth are different roots. So sometimes my present stem will come from one root, and my future stem will come from an entirely different root.
So if they're from two different roots, when did they become or who determined that they would be the same or in the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I don't really understand how this happens in the hoary past, okay? But this happened in English as well. Take the verb, I go. That's our present tense form. Yes, our past tense is I went. Where in the world did that come from? Did the go root somehow morph into went? Yeah. And by the way, we get go, gone, and going all from the go root. But the went root actually comes from a different root, which is wend. Yeah, whoa is right. That's Wednesday. So the verb to wend is an old English word that isn't used in our present context hardly ever at all. Maybe in some situations where we're being poetic and we sort of take it out of its, archaic, repository. And we would say something like, the stream wends its way through the meadow or something like that. Okay, to wend. It means to go. Okay, so what happened, and I don't know, some committee got together in the past in English and said, hey, let's borrow a completely different verb root to form our past tense, but we'll keep the go root for all the other forms. Okay, so we don't say I go, I goed. We say I go, switch, I went, back to go, I have gone, and I am going. Okay, so we do this in English.
Does that have to do with phonics, basically the way that it's pronunciated and how it sounds?
This is not an issue of that, okay? So I'll give you a really fancy, smancy word. The process is called suppletion. Suppletion. That's taking a completely different root to form one of your tenses. You might want to know this if you're on Jeopardy someday.
You just say I win.
Right. Okay. The adjective is suppletive. So if we would say that this is a suppletive form. Okay. Now, back to these. So you can see that these are coming from completely different roots. And we have Lego, which is I say. That's the present. And the future is arrow. Now, how in the world did leg become air? Air Jordan is the only thing I can think of that would bring those together. Michael Jordan used his legs and he sailed through the air. Okay. But again, this is a situation where the present uses the leg root and the future tense is actually using the air root. Okay. Two completely different stems. I think you guys have asked me in the past, so should I memorize the principal parts of verbs? And my answer is always, if the principal parts are normal, no. But if they are very abnormal, like they come from two completely different roots, you should memorize the principal parts where the roots are different.
A list of the ones that come from different roots.
In the principal parts appendix, you're going to be able to look at all of the forms, and you'll see which ones are derived from different roots, because the forms will be so wildly different. Okay, so we will move on here. Well, actually, you know what? There is one more set. It's good to just review these things. We have the verb horao, which is a contract verb. Horao, and the verb opsamai, which is the future. Oops, that's smooth breathing. Opsamai. Okay, and what are the roots here? They're different. Okay, so this is actually, I'm giving you the lexical form. It's really supposed to be haro. Okay, that's the present. So this is from hora, and this is from, believe it or not, this, opt. Actually, I need to check on that. He gives it, he says op. I think that there's a tau in here. Either way, you can see that there is no relationship between these two. All right? They're coming from completely different roots as well. Okay, now, if you look at the handout, this is where things get a little bit dicey. My number 3 is pattern number 4. Why, oh why, must you confuse me, Dr. Marshall? I'm trying to unconfuse you because I think Mounce is confusing here. Okay? Mounce's pattern 4 is roots modified regularly. And what I've done here is I've skipped his pattern 3 because he admits that pattern 3 is really not a pattern. For him, pattern 3 in this lesson is liquid futures. But then he goes on to say that liquid futures do what? He says they follow pattern 4. But what we're actually going to see is that's not true. Liquid futures do not just follow pattern 4. Liquid futures can follow other patterns too. All right? So I really think that he's confusing and misleading at this point. I don't know. If I were writing this chapter, I love the chapter, except I would have just written 3 patterns. Here they are. And by the way, let's look at liquid futures now. Oh, see how they follow the patterns that we've just learned. They don't always follow one pattern. Okay? And so that's what I'm going to do. Now, so let's skip over to pattern number 4, which is on page 174. So we'll jot that down here. Page 174. And this is beginning with 20.20. 2020 vision. All right. So take a look here at what he says. These are, in 2020, roots in this category are modified in regular ways. So we're going to have a verbal root. The verbal root is going to be modified to form the present stem, but that modification will be a modification that is fairly regular. That is to say that there are consistent ways that the verbal root is modified in order to create these present patterns for particular kinds of verbs. In most of the cases, knowing the pattern is sufficient for recognizing an inflected form. However, in a few of the cases, it may be easier to memorize a certain form. These roots fall into 3 basic subpatterns. Okay? So, subpattern number 1. These are roots and a stop. That is to say, roots, just to make this clear, ending. All right? Where the root ends in a stop. Well, again, let's remind ourselves, what is a stop? Yes, a stop is a consonant where what happens to the airflow? It stops. Excellent. It comes to a complete stop. Okay? And when we have roots that end in a complete stop and then they are brought over into the present stem, there can be a certain kind of typical modification here, okay? So the first kind are the verbs that we will learn have forms in the present of idzo. Actually, I was going to put a little dot there, but I can't do that in Greek, can I? Don't dot your I's. And you can't really cross your T's either. So idzo and odzo verbs. Okay. Now, these are derived from dental stems. That is to say, stems that end with a dental consonant. Okay. So let's take our root bop tid. Okay. See how that ends with a dental? Delta is a dental stop. D. If you try to pronounce a D sound, all the airflow stops, and then it's released. D. D. Okay, so dental stop. So what's happened now is this dental stop has been modified. I almost hesitate to say this, but I'll go ahead and say it anyway. There is something called a consonantal iota that was added to the dental stem, and the combination of the delta plus the consonantal iota produced the zeta sound. So we get the bop tids out of that, okay? So bop tid becomes bop tids. We've modified the real root to form the present stem, okay? And then that's where you get bop tid zo from. Now, we also have some forms where the present, the lexical form will end with this. It'll be an also verb, also. And these are derived from roots that are velar, okay? So, actually, I put stems here. This should be a dental root, okay? So these are velar roots. Let's take a verb like tarach. Okay, so the real root of tarasso is tarach. Okay, so it ends with a chi. What kind of a consonant is chi? Chi is a velar. Okay, and again, this chi is going to be modified to produce taras for the present stem. What's going to be interesting is that when we form the future, as we're going to see, the futures are going to use the real roots. Okay, so let me go ahead and just show you what happens here. Okay, and this will explain why the future will look so different from the present. But what you should realize is, oh, the future is normal. You're going to think the future is irregular if you don't think the right way, but the future is actually going to be normal. What's the future going to be for baptizo? It's baptizo. I baptize. Why is it baptizo? Because it's using the real root baptid plus a sigma. Baptid so becomes baptizo. What is the future of this verb? It's actually taroxo. Okay? Now, if you think this verb will just add a sigma to taros, you're going to have a problem with a triple sigma. That'd be a real bonus, but you won't see that. Why is the future taroxo? Taroxo, I will trouble you. It's because it's coming from the real root tarach. When I add a sigma to a velar chi, what happens? It becomes a xi, right? Baptid is my real root, and that is also the future stem. And when I add the sigma to the delta, oops, I left that iota there. So when I add the sigma, the delta drops. Okay? When we learn the aorist tenses, we're going to see that they're actually going to be more, the aorist stems will be more like the verbal root as well. So it's the present that's the odd one out here. Okay? But this is a fairly regular pattern for modifying the verbal root to get the present stem. Now, let's look at the next example here. So, okay, so what are our double consonant verbs? Well, these are verbs like balo, okay? I throw, balo, okay? And compare that with the real verbal root, ball, all right? So what's happened here? The present stem has taken the real verbal root ball that has a single consonant and has modified it so that it produces a double consonant. All right, so balo, ball. Can you see the real root here? And you can see that it's been modified slightly, right? Okay, good. Let's look at the next one. Sometimes, and this is C, we could have letters added to create the present stem. Letters added. And all of these are how the present stem can be related to the verbal root. Okay? So present stem. Let's take a look at the verb iro. All right. Now, the real root of iro, which is I lift up, is ar. It's a good pirate verb. Ar. I lift up the booty. Okay? Ar. What's happened here? Okay? What's actually happening is the R has added what I told you was a consonantal iota. That actually happens in these other forms as well. It adds a consonantal iota. It's not written out. And then the form ends up creating an I sound before the rho. So it becomes iro. Now, you can see that the alpha and the rho of the root are present, but I have an extra letter in here. Okay? So that's one way to see it. You could also have the SK infix. You could see an SK added. So let's look at a couple of examples here. We have a verb like apathnesko. Okay. What is this from? Well, the real verbal root is apathon. Okay? Apathon. So what's happened here? We have apathon modified with the addition of an SK after the nu. The alpha of thon has dropped out. See that? You have theta nu over here. I have the apa part, that's all fine. But theta, missing the alpha nu. Then I have an extra vowel, and I have an iota subscript in there as well. I think Mounce puts the iota in parentheses, doesn't he? Sometimes you can see SK infixes and sometimes iotas before that. Okay, you don't need to, worry your pretty little heads over being able to understand all this. What I'm just wanting to see is that the present stem of apathnesko, I die, is bigger than the root. Iro is bigger than the root. They have things added to them to form them. Whereas the future tense is going to use the root itself. I will raise in the future is going to be ro. Okay? It's going to use that ro root. It's going to be more normal than the present was. Okay? And apathnesko's future is apathanumai, which is going to actually use the same root too. So I'll go ahead and write that down. Apathanumai. Again, we'll talk about why some of these futures don't have any sigmas, okay? All right. Another example of letters moving around. So this is D, is ablaut. And if you remember, I referred to this as vowel gradation, where vowels can change their length or sometimes drop out altogether. And example is apathnesko. Did you see how the alpha of the root apathan dropped the alpha? It went all the way to 0 or nothing in the form apathnesko because there's nothing between the theta and nu here. Okay, so that's the big hairy ball of wax. All right, so liquid futures. Let's talk about this type of verb form here. What we're dealing with liquid futures are forming the future tense with verbs that have stems. The future stem is going to end with a liquid consonant. All right, so what are the liquid consonants? Okay, so lambda, rho, mu, and nu. Okay, lambda, rho, mu, and nu. If my future stem ends with one of these liquid consonants, then I'm going to have some issues. And the problem here is that these liquid consonants do not play nice with sigma. Okay, so liquid consonants don't play nice with the sigma. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. Let's take a verb like balo. The future stem is bal. So what should I do when I want to make it future? The future stem takes the verbal root bal. It uses it for the future stem. And I should put a sigma here. And then my connecting vowel and personal ending. So let's say we want to do here. We will throw. Balsamen. All right? The lambda and sigma say, hey, we don't get along. You're going to have to change your ways or we're not going to be able to form the future. And what happens here is that the tense formative sigma is going to have to slightly change to the tense formative epsilon sigma. Okay? So this puts some distance between these two things that don't get along well. All right? Exactly. So I'm going to be left with bal sa men. Okay? So then we have an issue. Intervocalic sigma. What does intervocalic mean? Yes, between two vowels. Vocalic means vowel. Between, intervocalic. Now, Dr. Brookins likes to talk about the intergalactic sigma, where the sigma takes off and goes into the heavens and you don't see it. I am a bit more pessimistic. I think of sigmas falling into Sheol or Hades. Either way, whether they go to heaven or hell, they're gone. It doesn't matter. Okay? So the sigma between the two vowels will drop out, and I'm left with epsilon and omicron. And what do you think will happen when that occurs? we get contraction, right? And remember your contractions? Epsilon omicron. What does that produce? Omicron upsilon, exactly. So I'm going to be left with a form like balumen, and I'm going to have a circumflex here, reflecting that long diphthong, the loss of the sigma here. So balesamen becomes baleamen becomes balumen. We will throw. Now, the resulting problem is that what you have always identified as your future tense formative is no longer visible, is it? You can't see it. You can't see it. How are you going to tell the difference between we will throw and we are throwing?
The accent maybe?
Okay, there's a couple of things. Future active indicative, present active indicative, both of them first person plural. You see the difference here? Balumen versus balamen. What's the first thing that should jump out at you here? The stems are different, aren't they? Which one is more like the root? The future. The future is more regular in that regard. The present has doubled the final consonant to form its present stem. Okay. Also, I've got a contraction issue between the end of the stem and the personal ending here. Whereas in the present, I don't get contraction because there's nothing falling out, causing a connecting vowel to contract with anything. Okay. And then my men is exactly the same either way. Okay. So in my liquid futures, where that epsilon sigma then releases the sigma and the epsilon contracts with whatever the connecting vowel is after the sigma, I'm going to be looking for contraction plus a circumflex here. Okay? All right. Let's look at a couple more examples of this, okay? Let's take meno. It's one of our new verbs for this chapter. Meno is I remain. So the present is meno, like this. Okay, that's the present active indicative, first person singular. How would I say I will remain, future active indicative? I take men, which is actually my future stem. It happens to be the same as the present stem. But instead of adding sigma omega, what do I have to put before the sigma? Got to put an epsilon. What's the sigma going to do? It's going to fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory? Yeah, that's heavenly, right? Or drop into the grave. And then I'm going to be left with epsilon omega, which contracts to what? Just omega. So my result is meno. And look at where the accent is. It's on the omega, the result of the contraction. Meno. Versus present active indicative, meno. Meno. Can you see the difference between those two? Okay. So this is I remain. Meno. I will remain. Okay. Let's look at a couple of examples that Mounce discusses. Actually, here, let's do this. Let's just stick with meno here for a minute. So realizing that once I do all of these changes here and get the contractions, what I'm going to be left with is a form of men plus lengthening and my normal personal endings. It's going to end up being meno, menes, mene, menumen, men, ete, okay, and then finally men, sin. Okay, what do you see in all these forms on page 172? Well, we have diphthongs, or an omega here, and we have a circumflex all the way down the line, right? So let me have you say these with me, everybody. Meno, I will remain. Menes, you will remain. Mene, he, she, it will remain. Menumen, We will remain. Menete. Y'all will remain. And menusin is they will remain. I'm sorry, my epsilon looks so awful there. Okay. Now, compare that with meno. The accent in the present is going to try to stay on the first syllable. Meno, menes, mene, menemen, menete, and menusin. All right? And no contraction. Now, I can also put liquid futures into the middle tense, or excuse me, the middle voice. Okay? So what would that look like? If I stick with men, I should put sigma for my future tense formative, and then my connecting vowel and my sci-tie endings. Okay? But you know, news and sigmas don't play nice together because nu is a liquid. So I get instead men esami. And then what will happen to the intervocalic sigma? It will drop out. And then the epsilon omicron will contract to oo. Okay? So what am I going to be left with when all is said and done? Menumai. And I'm going to have my circumflex on that diphthong. Menumai. That is the future middle indicative. Okay? How will I translate this? Well, I can't translate it as passive because it's not passive. We're going to learn the future passive in a later chapter because it uses a different stem than the future active and future middle. In future middles, the subject performs the action and also is affected by the action in some way. Here, I would probably translate this as just as if it were active. I will remain. Some people will add for myself as a way of glossing the middle. I remain for myself. I remain in my own interest, or something like that. All right. Now, the rest of these forms are going to have that contraction. Menumai. We're going to have men essi, men essetai, and all of these are going to undergo the same problem. Sigmas will fall out, contractions over here. This sigma is going to fall out, and we're going to have some really interesting things happen there. But this will end up being mene, okay, with an eta, which you've actually seen before, but without the circumflex. And this will be menesetai becomes meneetai, and then menetai with a circumflex there. Menetai. Can you still parse these by the personal endings? Absolutely. If you learn how to parse middles and passives earlier, you can still identify these. Okay? The question is going to be looking at the stem and the accent. Where's the accent at? All right. Now, let me look at one more thing with you here. Okay? Go to 20.18. No. Look at what Mounce does here. All right? For the verbs, we'll go ahead and just jot some of these down. We have the lexical form of I send is apostello. Okay? I always think of Abbott and Costello when I say that. Apostello. Notice that has a double lambda, right? Now, what is the real root here of apostello? It's this. It's apostel. Okay, that's the real root. So what's happened to the real root to form the present stem? We have doubled that lambda. Okay? Look at the future. It's oops, missed that tau. Apostello. Okay? What's happened here? Nothing's happened. I've just kept the real root and I've used it for my future stem. Okay? Apostello. Okay? Now, because it's a liquid, what's happened? It's added epsilon, sigma, omega, right? And that sigma's fallen out, and I've gotten the contraction here. So this is following one of the patterns that we saw. This was which pattern was this? The future stem is the root, and the present stem is the root modified, right? So this is a This is a predictable modification of the root from the present stem. Okay, so this is pattern 4. Okay, we'll put 4 there. Now look at balo. Okay, so balo, present, future, balo. Okay, what's the real root? Ball. Okay, so same thing, right? The future stem is identical to the real root. The present stem has modified the real root in a predictable way. This is pattern 4. Let's look at the word or the verb iro. Okay, if you look at this example of iro, present, aro, future, the real root is r. What's happened? The future is the same as the root. The present has modified in a predictable way the real root to form the present stem. Again, this is all pattern 4 stuff. Now, I want you to look at this next one. We're gonna jump past his examples. I want you to go to Lego. Okay? Lego is I say. The future, arrow. How are these related to each other? Well, they're not. Okay? So what I really have are 2 completely different roots. Leg and air. So which pattern is this? This is pattern 2. Is arrow a liquid future? Yes, it is. Because my future stem is air, which ends with a rho. That's a liquid consonant. So to say I will say, it's air, S so, sigma falls out, epsilon, omega contract, and I'm left with arrow. You see where that came from, okay? So this is indeed a liquid future, but which pattern is it following? Not 4, but 2, right? That is to say completely different roots. And then take a verb like kreno, and meno for that matter. The present is kreno, the future is kreno. Is this a liquid future? Absolutely. Are the stems the same? Yes, they're both kren, and they happen to both be the same as the root. Which pattern is that? That's pattern number 1. So what you can see is that the liquid futures actually could follow any of the 3 other patterns. So there really isn't a pattern 3 called liquid futures, is there? Liquid futures just follow the other 3 patterns. Okay? All right. So I'm going to write my own textbook and sell millions. All right. So that's Dr. Marshall's insane presentation on chapter 20. I love 20. I hate 20. I'm a conflicted man. All right. Good.